In the world of medicine, death has always been a part of life. But when elderly members of the community started dying between 2 and 3 p.m. in the town of Hyde, England, something didn't quite add up. This is a story of how analysis of basic statistics could have helped prevent hundreds of murders over nearly 20 years, and how these hidden numbers helped to expose a serial killer. In August 1974, Elaine Oswald, who was 25 at the time, walked into a local doctor's surgery because of a pain she had in her side. She'd intended to return back to work later that day. Elaine had never met this particular doctor before. He was just a few years older, with glasses and a smart brown beard. His warm and accommodating demeanour immediately stood out. He chose to sit down next to her as opposed to behind a desk, making her feel immediately at ease. The doctor believed she might have kidney stones and prescribed her strong painkillers and told her to rest at home. He told her that he'd stop by after his morning clinic finished and give her a blood test. Elaine appreciated his thoughtful concern and subsequently followed his advice. That afternoon, the doctor stopped by at her house like he promised, casually mentioning that his wife and son were waiting for him in the car, so he couldn't be too long. After a small prick of the needle to draw blood, Elaine's next memory was waking up on the floor, surrounded by 2 paramedics and the doctor looking down at her. She was quickly taken to the hospital, where the staff eyed her with suspicion, suspecting an overdose. However, the young doctor showed more compassion. He attributed to an allergic reaction to the painkillers and expressed his relief that he was there to administer life-saving care. Elaine was deeply grateful for his assistance and even agreed to have dinner with him and his family after her discharge from hospital. He even presented her with a medical alert bracelet to make sure that no other doctor would be confused and accidentally prescribe the same drugs. Elaine went on to raise 2 children, move to America and later become a professor of English. For 25 years, she believed that kindly doctor, Harold Shipman, had truly saved her life. She couldn't have been more wrong. Shipman was a trusted family doctor who worked near Manchester in northern England. As I've mentioned, to his patients, he was kind, caring and dedicated. But beneath this gentle facade lurked a horrific reality. You might know this already, but Dr. Harold Shipman is widely considered to be one of the most prolific serial killers in history. If you take the total number of victims of Ted Bundy, Jack the Ripper, John Wayne Gacy and Jeffrey Dahmer, combine them and then multiply the result by 3, that is close to the number of people killed by Dr. Shipman. This is a story of how simple statistical analysis could have stopped him much sooner, saving many, many lives. So, elderly patients were dying at an alarming rate, and as I've mentioned, always between 2 and 3 p.m. This oddly specific time frame was no coincidence. It just so happened to line up perfectly with Dr. Harold Shipman's home visits. In medicine, there are measurements called patient mortality rates, and this is just a fancy way of saying how many patients a doctor loses over time. These rates are really useful because they can tell us a lot about a doctor's practice. Are they treating high-risk patients? Are their treatments effective? Or, very occasionally, is something sinister going on? Typically, patient mortality rates for family doctors like Harold Shipman were pretty stable across the board. Sure, there were small variances here and there, but nothing too dramatic over time. But Shipman's numbers, they were off the charts. We're talking significantly higher than any other family doctor anywhere in the country. It's like if you had a class where most students scored around 60 to 80% on a test, but there was one student who consistently got every single question right on every single test. You'd start to wonder if all was as it appeared. So what were these numbers trying to tell us? Well, they were practically screaming that something was very, very wrong. But here's the thing, no one was listening. At least, not at first. Let's break it down with some cold, hard facts. The estimated excess mortality attributed to Shipman's practice was staggering. 174 women and 49 men aged 65 or over. Excess mortality sounds like complicated jargon, but in reality it's actually very simple. It's the number of deaths that exceed what you'd normally expect in any given population. In other words, these are the deaths that shouldn't have happened under normal circumstances. To put it in perspective, imagine you're watching a nature documentary about a lion pride. You'd expect to see a certain number of zebras become lion food every year. But if suddenly the number of zebra deaths doubled or tripled, you'd begin to suspect that the lions may not be behaving normally, right? That's essentially what was happening with Shipman's patients. Picture a graph of patient mortality rates. The line should be relatively flat, but on this graph, it's climbing up and up, like a mountain slope. That's what Shipman's patient mortality rate looked like. The statistical evidence was screaming at the top of its lungs, but for years, no one was paying attention. But why not? Why didn't anybody notice? Well, we'll come to that in a minute. For now, let's take a moment to appreciate the power of these simple statistical methods. They're not just dry numbers on a page. In cases like this, they're potential lifesavers. Well, they would have been if anybody had taken a second to look at Dr. Harold Shipman's data. We're now going to take a slight detour to New York, 1976. Two friends, Jody and Donna, were just having a conversation in their car outside Donna's home. Both were pursuing careers in the medical field, Donna as a medic and Jody as a nurse. Sadly, Donna's journey would end that night. A man approached, pulled out a pistol, and shot them. Donna died instantly. Jody, however, luckily survived the bullet wound to her leg. Traumatized, Jody recognized this narrow escape from death. Unlike Elaine Oswald, she didn't spend the next 25 years thinking that her attacker was a hero. The NYPD was coming under extreme pressure to locate this killer, known as the Son of Sam, who was spreading fear throughout New York City. They ultimately succeeded, as they knew the threat they were facing and put the resources required into capturing David Berkowitz. Meanwhile, Greater Manchester Police faced a contrasting dilemma with Harold Shipman. They were completely and utterly unaware of absolutely any issue at all. People were dying, but Shipman was insisting it was due to natural causes. Friends and family were often surprised by these deaths, but since the victims were often elderly and living alone, suspicion of foul play was virtually non-existent. For years, the numbers whispered their dark secret, but it wasn't until 1998 that finally people began to listen. This is Kathleen Grundy, an 81-year-old widow and the former mayor of Hyde. On June the 24th, 1998, Kathleen was found dead in her home just hours after a visit from Dr. Shipman. Sad, but not unusual. Elderly people do die all the time. But Kathleen's daughter Angela was stunned to find out that she'd been cut out of her mother's will. Instead, her entire estate, worth about £386,000, or just under $500,000 US, was left to, you guessed it, Harold Shipman. Now, if you think this sounds fishy, you're not alone. Angela was suspicious too, especially when she saw the will itself. Imagine it, a poorly typed document riddled with typos and errors, supposedly written by a woman known for her attention to detail. It was like finding a sloppy crayon drawing in place of the Mona Lisa. Something was definitely wrong. This bizarre will was a thread that, when pulled, slowly began to unravel Shipman's carefully constructed image. This was the moment that ignored whispers finally turned into screaming alarms. Suddenly, people started asking questions. Lots of questions. But why did it take so long for anyone to notice? Why did it take hundreds of elderly people to die before someone raised the alarm? The answer lies in something called the representativeness heuristic. That was hard to say. Fancy name, but simple concept. Basically, our brains like shortcuts. Whenever we see something, our brains quickly compare it to what we think is usual or typical for that thing. In this case, people saw elderly people dying and thought, yeah, that's what old people do. It fit the stereotype, so no one questioned it. This cognitive bias is like wearing blinders. It prevents us from seeing what's really going on because we're too busy already confirming what we expect to see. And in Shipman's case, this was what allowed him to hide in plain sight for years. But Shipman didn't just rely on mental shortcuts. He actively manipulated the system to cover his tracks. He falsified medical records, changing details to make these people's deaths seem more plausible. He exploited the trust placed in doctors, knowing that very few people would question a respected family doctor's word. Think about it. If an elderly relative of yours died, would you demand to see an autopsy? Probably not. Shipman relied on that trust, using it as a shield against any and all suspicion. The case went unnoticed not just because of Shipman's deception, but because of all of our own internal biases. We just couldn't see the truth. It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle when someone keeps changing all the pieces when you're not looking. The worst thing about this entire case is that simple statistical methods, if applied earlier, could have saved hundreds and hundreds of lives. When investigators started looking into Shipman's case, they finally brought in statisticians and data analysts. If Shipman's crimes were like this jigsaw puzzle, these analysts were the ones who could step back and finally see the big picture. But it wasn't easy. The investigation faced some serious challenges. For starters, there's this weird social phenomenon where people just don't really like to question doctors. It's a bit like how you might hesitate to argue with a chef about how your steak is cooked, except, with much higher stakes. Then, there was the lack of rigorous data processes in these medical practices. For the truth to finally be uncovered, it would have to overcome not just Shipman's own deception, but also the system that allowed him to thrive. When the analysts looked at the data, it became immediately obvious that Shipman wasn't just a bad doctor, he was actively ending lives. The data revealed his modus operandi, injecting lethal levels of diamorphine into healthy patients during his home visits. But Shipman managed to evade suspicion for decades. He used the power of his position as a trusted doctor to exploit the gaps in the system. The lack of oversight, the trust people placed in him. It's like he found all the blind spots in the security cameras and simply danced between them. The systematic failures that allowed his crimes to go unchecked are pretty mind-boggling. It's not just about one bad apple. It's about a whole orchard that didn't have proper quality control. The lack of rigorous checks and balances in the system created the perfect storm, which allowed someone like Dr. Shipman to operate undetected. Now remember those deaths between 2 and 3 p.m. that we mentioned earlier? The investigators started focusing on this and the huge number of Shipman's patients that were dying in this very specific time window shortly after his visits. And this was the smoking gun. The data finally connected all of the dots, revealing a pattern that was too clear to ignore.
Police in Tameside and Greater Manchester are investigating the deaths of 20 people who are all patients of the same GP.
The power of data in piecing together this puzzle cannot be overstated. It took what seemed to be random, unconnected events and revealed a very sinister pattern lying underneath. The worst thing about this whole sorry episode is that all it would have taken is for one person to pay attention. It's an important reminder of the importance of vigilance and critical thinking, especially when it comes to those in positions of authority. Imagine putting a movie on TV, expecting it to be a comedy, but it turns out to be a horror. That's what it was like for the investigators when they finally pieced together the full extent of Harold Shipman's crimes.
Dr. Harold Shipman was brought to Tameside Magistrates Court to face charges of murdering an elderly patient and forging her will.
The numbers weren't whispering anymore, they were screaming.
A family doctor from Manchester who was charged last month with murdering one of his patients and forging her will has appeared in court accused of killing 3 more women.
The Greater Manchester GP, Dr. Harold Shipman, has been charged with another 7 murders. Dr. Shipman is already accused of killing 8 patients, and he'll face one of the largest murder trials in British history.
During World War II, the Allies developed clever ways to spot anomalies using statistics aiming to identify unusual patterns in random processes. Sequential testing is a method that evaluates the data as it comes in. Unlike traditional hypothesis testing, which requires a set sample size, sequential testing allows for continuous assessment. You make the decision to accept or reject a hypothesis as the data is collected, making the process more efficient. This reduces the number of samples needed to reach a conclusion, and is particularly useful when real-time testing is necessary. This method is like quality control in manufacturing. Instead of checking each and every item, a random sample is checked one by one. If defects appear early, production can be stopped and investigated, saving both time and resources. This principle applies to many fields, whether it's cookies or condoms. The statisticians applied a similar strategy when looking at Dr. Harold Shipman's patients, identifying suspicious patterns in the medical records. By tracking patient deaths over time, much like monitoring flawed products, Harold Shipman could have been flagged for scrutiny as early as 1984, years before his arrest in 1998, which would have saved over 100 lives. The Shipman inquiry, launched after his arrest, revealed a truth more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Shipman was a serial killer who had murdered at least 215 of his patients, with another 45 deemed as highly suspicious. That's over 250 lives cut short by the very person who is entrusted to protect them. Think about that for a second. 250 people. That's like the population of a small village. And these weren't just numbers on a page. Each one was someone's grandmother, father, sister, or friend. The majority were elderly women, people who should have been enjoying their golden years, not falling victim to a predator. The emotional impact on the families and the community was absolutely devastating. Imagine finding out that your loved one didn't just die, but was murdered by someone you trusted completely. One victim's family member said, "It was like, I can't believe this. Wanting to not believe it because you have such faith in him is a kind of betrayal that shakes you to your core and makes you question everything." In the end, it was the sheer numbers that brought Shipman down. All those statistical anomalies, the unusual patterns, the excess deaths, they all came together to form an undeniable picture of guilt. The numbers told a story that no amount of lying or manipulation could hide. Shipman was convicted in 2000, found guilty of 15 murders.
Guilty of murdering 15 of his patients, Harold Shipman is sentenced to life.
This afternoon at Preston Crown Court, Judge Thane Forbes, visibly upset, told Dr. Harold Shipman life must mean life.
But as I've already mentioned, the Shipman inquiry finally laid bare the true extent of his crimes. It was a victory for data, for science, for maths, and in a way for justice. But it was a bittersweet victory, coming far too late for hundreds of victims. The silver lining, if you can call it that, is that change did come in the wake of this tragedy. The Shipman case led to massive reforms in the way doctors are monitored in the UK. The medical system got a complete overhaul. New checks and balances were put in place, the death certification process was tightened, and there was a renewed focus on using data to spot unusual patterns. It was these very improvements that allowed authorities to discover the crimes of Lucy Letby, the nurse convicted in 2023 of killing 7 babies. And these safeguards cut short her murder career potentially by decades. You don't need to be a statistics expert to apply the lessons of the Shipman case. It's about staying curious, asking questions, and trusting your instinct when something seems off. Whether it's a doctor's diagnosis or a news article, a little bit of healthy skepticism goes a long way. Remember, numbers don't lie, but people can. So next time you're faced with a crazy claim or statistic, take a moment to dig a little deeper. You never know what you might find. And on the subject of data, if you've liked this video, the data that tells YouTube that is to hit that like button, to share, and subscribe. I'll see you next time.